The sun was bright, and the morning air felt fresh as the Johnson family loaded their luggage into the back of their car. This vacation had been planned for months, and every family member had been counting the days until it finally arrived. For weeks, their house had been filled with excited conversations about beaches, swimming pools, and adventure. The father, Charles Johnson, a man who carried enormous responsibility in his professional life, had promised his wife and children that this trip would be different from all others. He had sworn to himself that he would leave his phone aside, silence work calls, and live in the moment. It was a rare chance for him to step away from the weight of duty, and more importantly, to simply be a husband and father. His wife, Melissa, was equally enthusiastic. She had taken care of every small detail, from booking the resort to packing snacks for the road trip. She wanted this time to be about laughter, joy, and memories, especially for their children. Their two kids, 12-year-old Daniel and 9-year-old Ava, could hardly contain their excitement. They argued playfully about which activities they would do first, the swimming pool or the beach. Their cheerful voices filled the car as they began the long drive toward the coast. For Charles, this vacation carried more meaning than the others. His job as an FBI chief was a badge of honor, but it also came with countless sacrifices. Late nights, constant stress, and the heavy burden of making decisions that impacted lives weighed on him daily. His work made him a respected figure in law enforcement, but it often stole away precious time with his family. He had missed school plays, sports events, and even quiet family dinners. This trip was his way of giving back the time he had lost and proving to his family that they were his true priority. The drive itself felt like part of the adventure. The family sang along to the music playing on the radio, the kids pressed their faces against the windows, pointing out farms, tall trees, and little towns they passed. Melissa kept handing out sandwiches and juice boxes, laughing when Ava spilled a little on her shirt. Charles found himself smiling in a way he hadn't in weeks. It felt good to watch his family laugh freely, without thinking about the demands of his job. After several hours, the site of the resort finally came into view. The large entrance gate, surrounded by palm trees and flowers, felt like an invitation to step into another world. The family couldn't stop marveling at the beauty of the place. The resort was known for its peaceful beaches, shimmering pools, and family-friendly atmosphere. It was exactly what they had imagined when planning this trip. As soon as they checked in and the bellboy carried their bags to the suite, the kids ran excitedly from room to room, discovering the balcony, the giant beds, and the view of the ocean waves rolling against the shore. Melissa stood by the window, breathing in the salty air, while Charles wrapped his arm around her shoulders. For a moment, it felt as if all the stress of the past months had melted away. The first afternoon was filled with laughter. The children begged to go straight to the pool, so the family changed into swimwear and headed downstairs. The poolside was lively with families, couples, and children splashing happily. Daniel and Ava jumped into the water without hesitation, while Charles and Melissa found lounge chairs nearby. Charles kept his sunglasses on, quietly observing, feeling grateful to simply watch his children enjoy themselves. Melissa leaned over and whispered, "See, this is all they needed. Just us being here." Charles nodded, his heart warm with appreciation. He felt the weight of his FBI badge tucked away safely in his bag, but for now, he wasn't the chief. He was just a father enjoying a family vacation. Later in the evening, the family took a walk along the beach. The golden light of the sunset stretched across the waves, and the sound of seagulls filled the air. Ava collected seashells, showing each one proudly, while Daniel tried skipping stones across the water. Melissa took pictures, capturing the smiles and the moments she wanted to remember forever. Charles walked slowly, his feet sinking into the soft sand, reflecting quietly. He knew how rare these simple joys were in his life, and he promised himself he wouldn't let anything spoil this time. Dinner at the resort's restaurant was a celebration in itself. The family laughed over shared dishes, tried new flavors, and teased one another over silly stories. The children talked about all the things they wanted to do during the trip: horseback riding on the beach, trying water slides, and exploring the nearby town. Charles listened patiently, agreeing to every plan, enjoying the sparkle in their eyes. That night, back in their suite, the family sat on the balcony together. The moonlight reflected on the water, and the sound of waves created a gentle rhythm. Daniel leaned against his father's shoulder, while Ava rested her head on her mother's lap. Melissa reached for Charles's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. They didn't need to speak, the silence was filled with peace. For Charles, this moment felt like a gift. He realized that while his career demanded his strength and attention, his family gave him the love and purpose that made it all worth it. This vacation was not just about fun, it was about rediscovering connection, laughter, and the importance of being present. He had no idea that soon their peaceful holiday would take an unexpected turn, one that would test his patience and reveal truths about the world his children would one day inherit. But for now, as the ocean breeze brushed against them, the Johnson family was simply happy, united, and free from worries. The next morning began with the sound of seagulls and the warm glow of the sun pouring through the curtains. Melissa was the first to wake, and she quietly stepped out onto the balcony to breathe in the fresh air. She watched the calm waves and smiled, knowing her family was still asleep inside, tired from all the excitement of the first day. This was exactly what she had hoped for: a break where they could feel at peace. Soon, the smell of coffee from the resort cafe filled the air, and Melissa decided to get everyone moving so they could enjoy breakfast together. Daniel and Ava woke up still full of energy. They were already planning their day, talking over each other about who would go down the water slide first and who would order pancakes at breakfast. Charles, though sleepy, laughed at their enthusiasm. He felt light, unburdened, as if the heavy shadow of his responsibilities had been lifted for a short while. As they walked to the resort's dining hall, he carried his daughter on his shoulders, while his son walked beside him, telling him stories about superheroes and adventures. The dining hall was lively. Families filled the tables, enjoying the buffet of fresh fruits, eggs, waffles, and pastries. The Johnsons settled at a corner table near a large window overlooking the pool. Daniel piled his plate high with bacon and toast, while Ava carefully chose strawberries and pancakes shaped like animals. Melissa sipped her coffee, laughing at the children's choices, and Charles leaned back, soaking in the warmth of the moment. But even in this perfect atmosphere, Charles couldn't help but notice something unusual. At a table nearby sat a woman in her mid-40s, dressed neatly, sipping her tea with a stern expression. Her eyes seemed to follow the Johnson family with unusual intensity. At first, Charles thought nothing of it: people often glanced around in public spaces. But as breakfast went on, he noticed the woman's gaze lingered too long. Whenever Melissa spoke or the children laughed, the woman glanced over as though something was out of place. Charles didn't mention it. He had dealt with people's silent judgments before and wasn't about to let it ruin the day. Instead, he kept his focus on his children, encouraging them to eat well so they'd have energy for the adventures ahead. Melissa noticed the woman too, but she brushed it off, telling herself not to imagine problems where none existed. After breakfast, the family headed to the pool. The area was crowded, filled with families lounging under umbrellas, children running, and the sound of splashing water echoing in the air. Daniel and Ava rushed into the pool, while Melissa settled with a book on a chair nearby. Charles swam a few laps, laughing with his kids, then came back to sit beside his wife. It was a beautiful day, filled with sunshine and laughter. But soon, that same woman from breakfast appeared at the poolside. She walked slowly, scanning the chairs and looking at people as if checking whether they belonged. When her eyes landed on the Johnson family again, her brows furrowed slightly. She chose a chair not far from them and sat down, though she hardly looked relaxed. Instead of opening a book or enjoying the sun, she kept glancing in their direction. At first, Melissa tried to ignore it, though she felt uncomfortable under the woman's stare. She leaned toward Charles and whispered, "Do you notice how that woman keeps looking at us?" Charles nodded slightly but kept his calm expression. He knew exactly what was happening. Over the years, he had grown used to people questioning where he belonged, whether silently or openly. But he also knew he had to set an example for his children to show them that not every glance or assumption deserved attention. The children, unaware of the tension, continued playing happily in the pool, diving under the water and racing each other from one side to the other. Their laughter filled the air, and for Charles, that was what mattered most. He wanted their innocence to last as long as possible. The day went on, and the family decided to explore the beach again. They rented bikes from the resort and rode along the shoreline. Ava's small bike had training wheels, and Charles jogged alongside her, cheering her on as she tried to pedal faster. Daniel rode ahead, calling for his mother to catch up. Melissa laughed, her hair flying in the wind as she tried to keep up with her son. These were the moments Charles had dreamed of, the kind of joy that came only from togetherness. But the peace was not without shadows. The same woman appeared again later at the beach area, standing near the cabanas. She seemed restless, occasionally pulling out her phone, her eyes narrowing whenever they landed on the Johnson family. Melissa noticed this and felt a twist of unease in her stomach. She tried to distract herself by helping Ava collect shells, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's interest in them wasn't innocent. By the evening, after a long day of fun, the Johnsons returned to their suite. The children fell asleep quickly, worn out from swimming and biking. Melissa, however, sat quietly by the window, her thoughts heavy. "Charles," she said softly, "that woman kept watching us the entire day. It's not just me, right?" Charles nodded, leaning against the balcony railing. "I saw it too," he admitted. His voice was calm, steady, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen such behavior many times before. Some people don't always understand. They judge before they know anything. But don't let it worry you. We came here for peace, and I won't let anyone take that from us." Melissa admired his calmness, though she still felt unsettled. She knew Charles carried himself with dignity no matter the situation, but she also knew the world wasn't always kind. She looked back at her children, asleep and innocent, and hoped that they would never have to carry the same worries their father carried. As night fell, the sound of the ocean waves filled the room once more. The Johnson family slept peacefully, unaware that the woman's suspicion was only growing stronger. In her mind, she had convinced herself that something about this family didn't fit, that perhaps they weren't supposed to be there. She didn't know their names, their background, or the truth about Charles Johnson's profession. All she saw was what her own assumptions allowed her to see. And those assumptions, built on prejudice and misunderstanding, were quietly building toward a moment that would soon disrupt the family's peaceful vacation. For now, though, the Johnsons rested in comfort, believing the hardest part of their trip would simply be choosing which adventure to enjoy next. They had no idea that the eyes watching them from a distance carried more than curiosity. They carried a storm that was slowly preparing to break. The third day of the vacation started just as bright as the first two. The sun was warm, the sky was clear, and the air carried the salty scent of the ocean breeze. Daniel and Ava woke up early, bouncing with excitement, asking their parents if they could go to the pool again before breakfast. Charles and Melissa laughed at their energy and agreed. They wanted their children to enjoy every moment, to make memories they could carry for years. By mid-morning, the family was once again at the poolside. The sound of splashing water, laughter, and upbeat music filled the air. Daniel challenged his father to a swimming race, while Ava practiced floating with her mother cheering her on. Melissa kept her phone nearby, taking pictures of the children and promising she would create a vacation album once they returned home. Charles, though playful with his children, stayed aware of his surroundings, as he always did. His years of training made it impossible to completely relax his guard, even when he was simply a father on holiday. It wasn't long before the woman who had been watching them the past 2 days appeared again. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, but Charles recognized her instantly. He noticed how her head turned slightly too often in their direction, and how her lips pressed together in disapproval whenever the children laughed too loudly. He had seen people like her before, people who looked at others not with curiosity, but with doubt. Melissa felt it too. She leaned closer to Charles and whispered, "She's here again. Do you see the way she looks at us?" Charles gave a small nod, his eyes calm behind his sunglasses. "Yes, I see her. But let's not let her ruin this day. The kids are happy. That's what matters." But ignoring the woman became harder as time went on. At one point, she stood near the pool steps, arms folded, and spoke to another guest. She gestured lightly in the Johnsons' direction, lowering her voice but making it obvious that she was talking about them. The other guest looked confused, nodded politely, and soon walked away. Still, the woman didn't seem satisfied. She watched every move Charles and his family made as if waiting for a reason to step in. When the children got hungry, the family left the pool area and went to the resort cafe for snacks. They ordered smoothies, sandwiches, and fries, laughing as Ava tried to sip her drink too quickly and got brain freeze. But the joy was interrupted when the same woman walked into the cafe. She stood in line but spent more time glancing at their table than looking at the menu. Melissa's smile faded as she noticed it again. She whispered, "She's following us now." Charles stayed calm, though inside he felt protective of his family. "It's okay," he said softly. "We'll handle whatever comes." By the afternoon, the family returned to the beach. The children ran along the shore, chasing waves, while Melissa spread out towels and snacks. Charles helped Daniel build a sandcastle, laughing as Ava insisted on decorating it with seashells. It was a moment of pure joy, but just as the tower of the sandcastle was completed, the shadow of the same woman appeared nearby. This time, she didn't just watch. She walked directly toward them, her footsteps sharp against the sand. Charles stood slowly, his body relaxed but alert. Melissa looked up nervously, already sensing trouble. The woman stopped a few feet away, her chin lifted slightly. "Excuse me," she said in a firm voice. "Are you guests here?" Melissa blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of the question. "Yes, we are," she answered politely. The woman's eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses. "Do you have proof of that? I've never seen you around here before. This resort is private. Only paying guests are allowed." Charles remained calm. His years of experience had taught him not to react with anger, even in the face of disrespect. "We checked in 2 days ago," he said evenly. "We're staying in one of the suites." But the woman didn't seem convinced. She crossed her arms tightly. "That doesn't sound right. I've been coming here for years, and I know most of the families. I've never seen you before. You don't look like you belong here." Melissa's face tightened, hurt by the words. The children, sensing the tension, moved closer to their parents. Daniel frowned, confused. "Dad, what does she mean?" he asked softly. Charles placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, signaling him to stay calm. The woman shook her head, her voice rising slightly. "If you're really guests, then show me your key card. Prove it. Otherwise, I'm calling security." Charles took a slow breath. He could have shown his key card immediately, but the woman's tone made it clear that no amount of proof would satisfy her. Still, for the sake of his children, he reached into the beach bag and pulled out the card. He held it up calmly. "Here's our room key," he said. The woman glanced at it briefly, but instead of apologizing, she muttered, "That doesn't mean anything. Anyone can pick up a card." I think I should call the police to sort this out. Melissa gasped quietly. Is that really necessary? We're just a family on vacation. The woman's lips tightened. Rules are rules. I don't want to see people trespassing here. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly. Within seconds, she was speaking into the device, her voice carrying across the beach. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious family at the resort. They don't look like they belong here, and I think they might be trespassing. Daniel's eyes widened, fear flickering across his young face. Ava clutched her mother's arm, whispering, "Mom, are we in trouble?" Melissa hugged her daughter tightly, whispering back, "No, sweetie, we're not in trouble. Everything's fine." Charles stayed still, his expression unreadable. He knew that situations like this could easily turn unfair. But he also knew the truth was on his side. He placed a hand on Melissa's arm gently, giving her silent reassurance. The woman continued speaking loudly into her phone, glancing at the Johnson family as though she had caught them doing something wrong. People nearby began to notice. Some looked uncomfortable, while others shook their heads at the scene. A few whispered among themselves, wondering why such a commotion was happening over a family enjoying the beach. When the woman hung up, she stood taller, almost proud of herself. "The police are on their way," she declared. "We'll get this sorted out once and for all." Melissa's heart sank. She hated the idea of their children being dragged into such an unnecessary conflict. She tried to reason with the woman one last time. "Please, there's no need for this. We've done nothing wrong. We're just here to spend time together." But the woman refused to listen. "If that's true, you have nothing to worry about," she replied sharply. The Johnson children huddled close to their parents, fear in their eyes. Charles bent down slightly, meeting their gaze with calm strength. "Don't worry," he said softly to them. "Everything will be okay. Sometimes people don't understand. But we'll handle this together." As they waited, the sound of distant sirens faintly reached the beach. The atmosphere grew tense, with onlookers whispering and the woman standing nearby with an air of self-importance. She truly believed she had done the right thing. What she didn't realize was that the truth, when revealed, would leave her shocked and embarrassed in a way she had never expected. For now, the Johnson family stood together, united, patient, and calm in the face of unfair suspicion. The children held tightly to their parents, Melissa's eyes glistened with worry, and Charles, though outwardly composed, prepared himself for the conversation that was about to unfold. He knew that the arrival of the police would change everything, not only for the woman who had made the call but also for the people watching, who would witness a powerful lesson about assumptions, respect, and dignity. The sound of sirens grew louder until it blended with the waves crashing against the shore. Guests at the resort turned their heads toward the entrance of the beach, curiosity rising as two police vehicles pulled up and parked near the boardwalk. The bright red and blue lights flashed across the sand, catching the attention of everyone nearby. People began whispering, some looking worried, others simply curious about what had happened. The Johnson family stood together near their towels, the children holding onto their parents, while the woman who had made the call walked forward with an air of confidence. She waved at the officers as they stepped out of their vehicles, pointing directly toward the Johnsons as though she had uncovered something important. "There they are," she said quickly. "That's the family I told you about. I don't think they belong here. I've been watching them for days, and something doesn't seem right." The officers, 2 men and 1 woman, walked across the sand with steady steps. Their expressions were neutral, but their presence was strong enough to silence the chatter around them. When they reached the Johnson family, one of the officers spoke in a professional voice. "Good afternoon, sir, ma'am," he said. "We received a call about possible trespassing at the resort. Could we please see your identification and proof that you're staying here?" Melissa's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her bag. The children looked up at their parents with fear in their eyes, unable to understand why their peaceful vacation had turned into such a scene. Charles, however, remained calm. He had faced tense moments before, but this one was different. It was personal. It wasn't about his job or duty. It was about protecting his family from humiliation. He nodded respectfully to the officers. "Of course, officer. We're staying here as guests. Here is our room key, and I also have my identification with me." Charles handed over the key card and his ID. The officer examined them carefully, then looked back at Charles with a curious expression. Something about the calm confidence in his voice and the respectful way he carried himself didn't match the image of someone breaking rules. Meanwhile, the woman who had called the police stood with her arms crossed, her lips curled in a small, satisfied smile. "See? I told you something was off. They probably found that key card somewhere. You should check properly." The officers didn't respond to her immediately. Instead, one of them turned back to Charles. "Sir, just for verification, could you also tell us your occupation?" Charles hesitated for a brief moment. He had come on this vacation determined to leave his work behind, to just be a father and husband. But now, his professional identity was the only way to end this unfair suspicion. Slowly, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a second form of identification. He handed it to the officer, his eyes steady and calm. The officer's eyes widened slightly as he read the card. He glanced at his colleagues, and they both leaned in to look. A wave of realization spread across their faces. The female officer straightened her posture immediately, her tone shifting to one of respect. "Sir," she said carefully, "you're an FBI chief." Charles gave a single nod. "Yes. And right now, I'm here with my family, on vacation. We are registered guests of this resort." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. The officers exchanged quick glances, clearly understanding the seriousness of the situation. They turned back to the woman who had called them, and their expressions were no longer neutral. The woman blinked, caught off guard. "What? That can't be right," she said quickly, her voice nervous now. "Are you sure? I mean, I thought they didn't belong here. I was only trying to help." But her earlier confidence had melted away. The smugness in her voice was replaced with uncertainty. The crowd around them, which had grown larger as guests gathered to watch, whispered louder now. People shook their heads, some with disapproval, others with disappointment at the scene unfolding. The female officer stepped forward, her tone firm but calm. "Ma'am, you called us here for no valid reason. This family is not trespassing. They are paying guests of the resort. And the gentleman you accused happens to be a high-ranking law enforcement official. Do you understand the seriousness of making unfounded claims?" The woman's face turned pale. She opened her mouth to argue but couldn't find the words. Her gaze flickered between Charles, the officers, and the growing number of onlookers who were clearly judging her actions. The reality of what she had done hit her all at once, and she shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes. Meanwhile, Charles crouched down to reassure his children, who still clung to Melissa. "See? Everything is okay," he whispered gently. "We've done nothing wrong, and now everyone knows that." Daniel nodded slowly, though his eyes were still filled with confusion, while little Ava hugged her mother tighter. Melissa's heart ached, not because of fear anymore, but because her children had been forced to witness such an unfair moment. She stroked Ava's hair softly, wishing she could shield both kids from experiences like this forever. One of the officers handed Charles back his identification with a respectful nod. "Sir, I'm very sorry for the trouble. You and your family clearly don't deserve this inconvenience." Charles accepted his documents, his expression steady. "I appreciate your professionalism," he replied. "But I hope this serves as a reminder that assumptions can hurt people, especially families who are just trying to enjoy themselves." The officer nodded again, clearly moved by the quiet strength in his words. The woman who had caused the scene stood silently, her head slightly lowered now. The confidence she had carried earlier was gone, replaced with visible embarrassment. Guests nearby shook their heads and murmured, some even giving her disapproving looks as they realized she had acted out of bias rather than fact. Melissa, though still shaken, took her husband's hand and whispered, "Let's just go back to our room. The kids need some peace." Charles agreed, but before leaving, he looked at the officers and then at the woman. His voice was calm but firm. "I don't need an apology. But I do hope that next time, before anyone judges a family by how they look, they take a moment to think about the harm it can cause. That would save everyone a lot of pain." With that, he turned back to his family. He lifted Ava into his arms while Melissa held Daniel's hand. Together, they walked back across the sand, their dignity intact. Behind them, the officers stayed with the woman, speaking to her in low voices. The onlookers began to scatter, but not without carrying the memory of what they had just seen. For many, it was a lesson they would not forget. Back in the suite, the Johnson family finally allowed themselves to breathe. Melissa hugged Charles tightly, whispering, "You handled that so calmly. I don't know how you stayed so strong." Charles smiled faintly. "Because of them," he said, looking at his children, now curled up together on the sofa. "They need to see strength, not anger. They need to see dignity in moments like this." Melissa nodded, her eyes filled with admiration. She knew her husband's strength came not just from his position as an FBI chief, but from the love he carried for his family. In that moment, despite the difficulty of what had just happened, she felt proud of him, proud of their unity, and proud that their children had parents who would always stand tall for them. The night fell gently over the resort, but the events of the day lingered in their minds. For Charles, it wasn't just about being cleared of false accusations. It was about showing his children that no matter how others judged them, they could rise above it with dignity. The world might not always be fair, but how they responded would always define their strength. The morning after the incident, the Johnson family woke up in their suite to the sound of the waves brushing against the shore. The children were quieter than usual. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, while Ava clung to her stuffed toy, her little face still showing signs of worry. Melissa noticed it immediately and felt her heart ache. Vacations were supposed to be joyful, carefree moments, yet the memory of the previous day still hung over her children like a shadow. Charles, already awake and dressed, walked over to the balcony. He looked out at the beach where everything seemed so calm, so peaceful, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. But inside, he knew his family had been changed by the events. He wasn't just thinking about the embarrassment or the false accusations. He was thinking about the lesson his children had just been forced to learn about the world. Melissa joined him at the balcony, placing a hand on his shoulder. "They're too quiet," she whispered softly. Charles nodded. "They're thinking about what happened. It's not easy for children to understand something like that. But maybe it's time we help them understand." Later that morning, after breakfast in their room, Charles called Daniel and Ava to sit with him on the sofa. Melissa sat beside them, gently stroking Ava's hair while Charles spoke in a calm, thoughtful voice. "Kids," he began, "I know yesterday was confusing. I know it was scary too. You probably don't understand why someone would call the police on us when we did nothing wrong. And you might be wondering why Mom and I didn't get angry. So I want to explain it to you." Daniel looked up with wide eyes. "Why did she do that, Dad? We didn't do anything bad. We were just playing." Charles took a deep breath. He wanted to be honest, but also gentle. Sometimes, people make quick judgments about others without knowing them. They might think something bad just because of how a person looks, or because they don't understand their life. That woman didn't know us, but instead of asking questions or minding her own business, she decided to assume the worst. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. But it happened. Ava frowned, her little voice trembling. But why us? Melissa kissed her forehead softly. Because not everyone sees the world the same way we do, sweetie. Some people still carry ideas that are unkind and unfair. But what matters is how we respond to those moments. Charles nodded in agreement. That's why I stayed calm yesterday. If I had raised my voice or gotten angry, it might have made things worse, and it would have scared you even more. I wanted to show you that when people treat us unfairly, we can still choose dignity, patience, and strength. That's how we rise above it. The children listened quietly. Daniel slowly nodded, his young mind trying to process the lesson. Ava leaned against her mother, comforted by her embrace. Melissa looked at Charles with admiration, grateful for his wisdom. She knew the incident had shaken them all, but it had also given them a chance to teach their children something valuable, something that no classroom or book could ever explain in the same way. Later in the day, as the family walked through the resort, they noticed the atmosphere had shifted. Guests who had witnessed the incident the day before now looked at the Johnsons with a mix of respect and regret. Some offered small smiles, others gave polite nods. A few even approached them quietly to apologize on behalf of what had happened, even though they had not been directly involved. One couple stopped Charles near the lobby. "We just want to say," the man said gently, "that we admire how calmly you handled everything yesterday. Most people wouldn't have shown that much grace. It was a lesson for all of us." Charles thanked them politely and moved on, not wanting to dwell on the incident any longer. But deep inside, he hoped that maybe, just maybe, a few people had learned something about patience, respect, and the harm that assumptions could cause. The resort staff also tried to make amends. The manager approached the family and personally apologized for the unpleasant experience. "We want you to know that we value your presence here," he said earnestly. "We'll be reviewing how situations like this are handled, to make sure no family ever feels unwelcome again." He even offered them complimentary activities, but Charles declined politely. For him, the true compensation wasn't gifts or gestures. It was simply the chance to spend time with his family in peace. Determined not to let the incident define their vacation, the Johnsons filled the remaining days with joy. They rode horses along the beach, laughed down the slides at the water park, explored the small town nearby, and enjoyed evening bonfires at the resort. Charles made sure every moment counted. He wanted the good memories to outweigh the bad ones in his children's hearts. One evening, as the family sat around a bonfire with other guests, Ava leaned against her father and whispered, "Daddy, today was the best day." Daniel nodded, adding, "Yeah, I don't even want to go home yet." Charles smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He realized that despite the challenges, his children were still able to feel joy and love. That was what mattered most. On their last day at the resort, as they packed their bags, Melissa looked at Charles thoughtfully. "Do you think we'll ever stop facing things like that?" she asked softly. Charles paused, then shook his head gently. "The truth is, probably not. The world isn't perfect. There will always be people who judge without knowing, who act without thinking. But what we can control is how we respond. We can teach our children to stay strong, to stay kind, and to never let anyone else's ignorance define who they are." Melissa smiled softly, holding his hand. "And that's why they're lucky to have you as their father." When they finally left the resort, the family felt lighter. They had walked through a difficult experience, but they had done it together. The children had learned a lesson about the world, but they had also learned a greater lesson about strength, patience, and dignity. On the drive back home, Daniel looked out the window and suddenly said, "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be like you. Not because you're an FBI chief, but because you stay calm when things are hard." Charles's eyes softened. "That's the best thing I could ever hear, son." Ava chimed in with her sweet voice, "Me too, Daddy. I want to be brave like you and kind like Mommy." The car filled with laughter, the kind of laughter that heals wounds and mends hearts. Melissa reached across the seat, taking Charles's hand in hers, squeezing it with love and gratitude. As the miles passed and their home grew nearer, Charles reflected on everything that had happened. Vacations were meant for rest, yet this one had brought a challenge none of them had expected. But in that challenge came a powerful reminder, that strength was not in titles or positions, but in the way one carried themselves in moments of injustice. His children had witnessed it firsthand, and he hoped it would stay with them for life. In the end, the Johnson family didn't just return home with seashells, photos, and souvenirs. They returned with a story of dignity, patience, and resilience. A story that showed them the world could be unfair, but that love and unity could always guide them through. And perhaps, somewhere in that resort, the woman who had called the police was also reflecting on her actions, realizing that quick judgments could lead to shame, while understanding and kindness could have led to friendship. Maybe she had learned something too. For the Johnsons, though, the most important part was simple: they had each other. And with that, they knew they could face anything the world placed before them.